Hello, welcome to the Boswell Book Company virtual event series. Today is day 4,786, and we are happy to host Jonathan Greenblatt, author of It Could Happen Here, in conversation, of course, with Milwaukee's Paul Schmitz. We've got a few wonderful co-hosts tonight as well, so I want to thank Nathan and Esther Pell's Holocaust Education Resource Center, the Jewish Community Relations Council, Congregation Emanu-el, and the Harry and Rose Sampson Family Jewish Community Center, all of them for their support of this event. Now, I'm going to turn things over to Samantha Abramson. Hi, Samantha. HERC's Executive Director for our super duper official introducing, and then I'm going to disappear. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Samantha Abramson. I am indeed the Executive Director at the Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education Resource Center. We are a program of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. We are joined here by our sister program of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, the Jewish Community Relations Council, in addition to our friends at the Harry and Rose Sampson Family JCC and the Congregation Emanu-el B'nai Jeshurun. Welcome. Thank you for working with us. And of course, a special thank you to Boswell Books, who is hosting this event. And as you all know, is just such a true gem for this community. And we are so privileged to have them. So thank you. For those of you who aren't familiar with HERC, we work to bring Holocaust education across Wisconsin. While we're based in Milwaukee, we serve audiences statewide. And with Wisconsin Act 30 mandating Holocaust education poised to take effect this fall, our work has never been more urgent or timely. A recent study done by the JCRC reported that anti-Semitic incidents in Wisconsin are up 459% from between 2015 and 2021. Specifically, in Wisconsin middle schools and high schools, between 2020 and 2021, there was an increase in 80% of anti-Semitic incidents. Many of these incidents relate to the Holocaust in some way, be it a swastika or some sort of rhetoric related to the Holocaust. Our HERC team has been mobilizing its efforts statewide, and I really mean that because our education team has been driving in their cars across the state, leading education workshops for our educators so that they are confident teaching lessons of the Holocaust and figuring out what to do when they encounter anti-Semitism in their classrooms. One of the resources we're always able to provide free of charge to our educators in Wisconsin is the Holocaust Education Map, teachholocaust.org, which is this wonderful digital platform of over 100 lesson plans that we have mined from some of the best experts in the world. And I'm really proud to say that one of those experts featured is ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. And that's why it is so perfect that Jonathan Greenblatt is here tonight. In Jonathan's latest book, he poses the statement, it could happen here. What could happen here? Well, this is what the book answers. Published this past January, the book sounds an alarm bell, warning that hate and systemic violence is gathering momentum in the United States, and that violence on a more catastrophic level may not be too far away. Those of us who study the Holocaust and other genocides know all too well the dangers of discrimination and what can happen when such hate is unchecked. Jonathan Greenblatt really needs no introduction. He's been everywhere on every television show and on every podcast lately, but I'm going to try anyway, very briefly. As the CEO of ADL since 2015, Jonathan Greenblatt has led all aspects of the world's leading anti-hate organization. Under Jonathan's leadership, ADL has modernized its operations, innovating its approaches to counter anti-Semitism globally through both digital and in-person means. Jonathan is an accomplished entrepreneur and leader with deep experience in private, public, and nonprofit sectors. Before his time in the ADL, he served in the White House as a special assistant to President Obama and director of the Office of Social Innovation. He came to that role after a long career in business, including as co-founder of Ethos Brand Water, which I remember buying when I was in college. And that business eventually was purchased by Starbucks. And also he helped form the All for Good platform, which was a large database for volunteer engagement. In conversation with Jonathan tonight is Paul Schmitz, a senior advisor at the Collective Impact Forum, CEO of Leading Inside Out, and author of Leads, Building Leadership for the Community, from the Community Up, and a former social innovation advisor to the Obama White House. They know each other. A Milwaukee resident, Paul is also on the board of the United Way of Greater Milwaukee and Waukesha County. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you two.
Great. Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Chris and Boswell Books and Daniel Golden. I am a Boswell Books addict. And so I'm always excited to be affiliated with Boswell Books, and also excited to be affiliated with Jonathan. It's been a friend. I think Jonathan and I met as part of Obama's transition team. That's 14 years ago.
Yeah,
I think 14 years ago.
2000, December 2008 or January 2009.
Yeah. And thank you to everyone. I'm actually coming to you from Southern California, where I had to go work this week. But it's one of those rare days where the temperature is the same in Milwaukee, but unlike here, that's rare. And so the fact that you're all with us, I hope a lot of you are watching this outside, because I'm watching the temperature there and it looks great. Just so people know, this is being recorded. I'll be trying to watch the chat and the Q&A box, but please place questions in the Q&A box, and I'll be monitoring that and trying to facilitate as many of those questions as possible. And with that, I'm excited to get started. And Jonathan, let's just start with, and if people haven't seen it, this is the book, It Could Happen Here. Really great and timely book, especially timely. But I want to start with, Jonathan, describe the it in It Could Happen Here. What's the unthinkable you see hate tipping us toward?
Well, first of all, let me just say right up front how grateful I am to be in dialogue with you, Paul, who, for those of you who don't know, is an extraordinary social entrepreneur who really helped to define the space of collective impact and reimagine the way we think about working with communities. Paul did that at Public Allies and has just been a real thought leader in the space for, well over a decade. I also would credit Boswell Books with giving me this opportunity. And Sam, I appreciated your nice introduction, because I really believe in independent bookstores. So the chance to be on with you all tonight is really gratifying for me. So what is the it? Look, I gotta say, in many ways, the it probably feels like the, Nazis marching through a college town in Virginia and an elected official thinking that there were fine people among them. The it feels like people from minorities who are gunned down in the stores, in the parking lots of the stores where they shop, or in the pews where they pray, right? Simply because of their identity. The it feels like people literally thinking that they could and attempting to execute a coup in real time and stream it over the internet. I mean, all of those things would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. But I wrote this book to describe the fact that I believe that our democracy is in peril. I believe that there are threats from multiple kind of sides. I believe that we could lose our democracy, and all of this could slip away if we don't appreciate this moment and work for it. And by means of background, I'm the grandson, as you know, Paul, of a Jewish Holocaust survivor from Germany. And my grandfather, who came here as a young man, the only country he ever knew was Germany. And before the rise of, the Nazi death machine, he never would have imagined when he was a young person, never, that one day the only country he ever knew would turn on him, regard him as an enemy of the state, destroy everything that he ever loved, slaughter almost his entire network of family and friends, and force him to come to America as a refugee. When he was a young person, he never would have guessed that one day he'd have grandchildren born in America. Never could have imagined it. And I am the husband of a political refugee from Iran. And my wife, who was born and raised in Iran, as was all of her family, as far back as they know. They never would have guessed, before the rise of the sort of death cult of Khomeiniism and the Islamic Revolution, that one day the only country they ever knew would turn on them, regard them as enemies of the state, destroy everything they ever loved, and force them to flee to America as refugees. When my father-in-law was a young man, he came to America in his 40s. He never would have imagined that one day his grandchildren, my kids, my nieces and nephews, would be born in America. I mean, that idea was absurd. He thought, of course, Iran. So flash forward to today, Paul, I think hate is a corrosive force that is eroding the foundations of our shared society. It is weakening the institutions and making us vulnerable to the kind of authoritarianism that tore apart Germany, that tore apart Iran. And so I don't think I can take for granted that my grandchildren, Paul, or frankly, your grandchildren, will one day be born here in America if we don't fight for what we have. My own history, my own family's history, tells me that we are kidding ourselves if we think that this democracy is ordained by some natural law, that the order of things will be preserved eternally unless we lean in and really fight for what we have.
What do you think are the primary forces kind of driving us to that point right now?
Well, I would say that's a good question, Paul. I think, in many ways, I would say our thesis at ADL is that, again, hate has been this constant virus that's been with us for time immemorial, and specifically the variant of that virus that we know as anti-Semitism, an animus against Jews. It's been part of Western civilization, literally, since the advent of the Roman calendar, if you will, right? Since the dawn of the age of Christ. Now, that being said, and we can talk about how it's evolved and whatnot, but I think they call anti-Semitism the oldest hatred, but I think the better way to think about it, Paul, is a canary in the coal mine. I mean, anti-Semitism, which is essentially the oldest conspiracy theory, the idea that this group of people, this minority, was responsible for society's ills. And it often augurs other forms of hate. Societies that are conditioned to believe that they can attribute all their problems to one minority oftentimes will then free associate, if you will, and blame other groups. And so indeed, anti-Semitism begets and is related to other conditions like racism, xenophobia, anti-Muslim bias, et cetera, et cetera. It's a fear of the other. So we try to understand, why is society at the risk of unraveling? Why do I believe we could see violence on the kind of scale America hasn't seen since the Civil War? Why do I think that? Why do I think that? Because, number one, I think hate and the coarsening of the public conversation has conditioned us to the kind of depravities that, again, just a few years ago would have seemed unimaginable. So the coarsening of the conversation, which has been enabled and I would say kind of accelerated by, number two, kind of public figures, call them populists, but they have ridden and they've exacerbated polarization to great effect with devastating results. Donald Trump looms large in that pantheon, but polarization existed before Donald Trump. And it's not unique to it's not just the Provence of the right, even though he brought us to new lows in this country. So number two, you have that. I think number three, so you have number one, again, the coarsening of the conversation. Number two, you have public figures who've exploited polarization. Number three, you have extremists. You have extremists who've embedded themselves in the political process in ways we've never seen before. Trump let some of them in. There are lots of examples among the GOP. There are also examples on the Democratic side of extremists, arsonists, who seem intent not on building, but on only tearing down. And who, shift the Overton window, Paul, with every conspiracy theory and QAnon craziness that they push out. And then finally, I think social media. So all of these forces, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. They feed off of each other, but social media has enabled the expansion and amplified these forces in ways we never could have predicted, 10 years ago. But the level of division and the level of divisiveness, the level of vitriol, social media has really, I think, amped all of it up to a level beyond which we'd previously seen.
So talk about, you have this pyramid of hate that the ADL uses. And I found it important how much you stressed the importance of beginning at the bottom of the pyramid to address root causes of hate, and why addressing microaggressions is important to ultimately preventing things like genocide or civil war, et cetera. So could you talk a little bit about the pyramid and why dealing at the bottom of the pyramid is so important?
Yeah. So the book was written with the intent of being a bit like a playbook on how to counter prejudice. It's not only written, I didn't only wrote it to kind of work through what I was seeing here at ADL, but I also wrote it so that I could share the strategies and the tactics and the techniques we've developed. Because again, this hate seems to be this virus that's spread with such viciousness, right? Now, the pyramid of hate is fundamental to not just the book, but our approach at ADL. It's a sociological construct that is based on this idea that hate doesn't, genocide doesn't just happen. The conditions are created in which you can see hate mutate and morph into something increasingly serious. And it starts with biased attitudes. It then grows to like prejudiced kind of actions, like prejudiced words. It then goes to systemic discrimination. It then goes to acts of violence. It then goes to genocide. So starting at the bottom, biased ideas can be things like microaggressions or prejudiced attitudes that may seem subtle or slight, but when not confronted, when not wrestled down, they can grow, again, from attitudes to actions. And actions can be, speech, actions can be bullying, actions can be one-off examples of discrimination, which can then harden into policies, right? Modes of practice. And we were talking earlier on the issue of low-income housing, banking, the criminal justice system. There's so many examples of where biased attitudes morphed into, acts of prejudice, calcified into longstanding patterns of institutionalized discrimination, which then create an environment in which violence, the likes of which we've seen in the American South, for example, and other parts of the country, can really prevail. And I mean violence from threats to vandalism to real world assaults, arsons, etc., which can then explode into violence at the kind of scale that one might consider genocide. So you think this is insane, but it's not too long ago that our TSA agents were intentionally separating children from their family at the border. And if that seemed crazy, it wasn't too long before that, for the federal government was physically removing Japanese American families from their homes and transporting them across the country in a kind of trail of tears. I mean, these things are not distant memories. I mean, frankly, we're coming up on the 25th anniversary of the murder of Vincent Chin, right? A hate crime in Detroit that was created in an environment where there's a great deal of Japan bashing and kind of Asia bashing. And so biased attitudes mutated into like public bullying. I mean, movies and in popular culture, which then metastasized into, again, the actual violence against this Chinese American man who was beaten to death in a parking lot on the occasion of his bachelor party by a father and son who worked in the auto industry who thought he was Japanese just because he sort of identified as AAPI. So I say all this, Paul, because the pyramid of hate is a model that we use to help people understand why, if you don't interrupt early, these what might seem small can metastasize into something quite sinister.
Jonathan, Leila asked a follow-up on that. Can you give us some examples of microaggressions?
Microaggressions can be, being heteronormative and making somebody feel uncomfortable about the way you perceive their sexual orientation without giving them a chance to identify who they are. Microaggressions can be treating, employees who present as maybe ethnically or racially different in a distinct way from, let's say, white identifying employees. Microaggressions can be making women feel secondary or inferior by the way that you talk to them about the work that they do and its level of importance. I mean, microaggressions can manifest in a lot of ways, but typically it's verbal or it's kind of physical cues that can make someone feel vulnerable based on their difference.
Yeah. Jonathan, you, and we get to thank you for including queer folks and examples. You talked, one of the things I found interesting in the book was your take on so-called cancel culture, which I often find funny because a lot of the people who are so-called canceled are using major national platforms to complain about
Right,
people that
right.
they're on.
I'm canceled on cable, on the Fox News channel,
Right.
most watched channel in America.
But you reframed it in a really interesting way that I really loved as counsel culture, and talked about showing grace to those who show amends and seek to change. And that seems, I appreciate that, because so often it's like either we hear, I mean, we sometimes hear called consequence culture, which I get, but I really thought it was an important thought. And you had some really unique examples of ways that you've sought to bridge and reach out to people who've done things that are enormously offensive, if not even violent, and sought to bridge to those who are trying to change. And I'd like you to talk a little about reframing cancel culture as counsel culture.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think that reframe, I don't get the credit for it. A guy named Nick Cannon, who's a pretty well-known entertainer and musician, he shared that term with me and it really stuck. And it stuck on multiple ways. I mean, one of which is in Judaism, we have this, there is this concept called tshuva. And if someone speaks Hebrew, they'll probably pronounce it better than I do watching us. Tell me I mispronounce it. But tshuva is this notion of redemption. That all of us, and it's an acknowledgement that, look, we're made in the image of God, but we're not God. I mean, we all are fallible. We all sin. That's a Jewish concept. It's a Christian concept. It's a Muslim concept. I think you find that in all the major faiths, monotheistic faiths. And look, we sin, we repent, and we try to do better. So Jews do that through Yom Kippur. Catholics do that through confession. So many of our faiths have this practice embedded in our ritual and our traditions. And so this notion of cancel culture, someone says something wrong and then you permanently eject them from the public square. Like, I deeply disagree with that. And I'm proud of the fact that not just in the Jewish faith, but at ADL, we have a tradition when someone errs, we will call it out for sure, but you also call them in. And you also try to embrace the sinner and try to help them to do better. Because again, but for the grace of God, go all of us. So this is material in as much as here at ADL, I've had experiences with professional athletes who have, said hateful things toward Jews, toward other minorities. I've become very close to a former white supremacist who was a skinhead and who was involved in an attack on a synagogue. And I was connected with him at a later point in his life. And look, he acknowledged his error, and my time with him has evolved into a really beautiful friendship. I have a very close relationship with a former, Islamic fundamentalist, like a political Islamist sympathizer who wanted to destroy the Zionist state, quote unquote, who now, Imam Abdullah Antepli, is a close friend of mine and has done an extraordinary work bridging the gap between Muslim and Jewish and Muslim and Christian communities. So I think many of us, if we're willing to have the humility, will acknowledge that we all err, and we need to walk humbly and remind ourselves of that. Now, I will say, Paul, that doesn't excuse someone who is a serial offender. That doesn't mean you embrace someone whose arrogance inhibits them from acknowledging their own mistakes. That doesn't mean you welcome the person who refuses to admit that they've done any wrong or harm. But we need to try to create space for those conversations to give people the opportunity. And ultimately, I think all of us can learn from that, not just the sinner, but the person who feels sinned against, right? Not just the person who's grieving, but the person who feels aggrieved. So That's core to our work at ADL and our kind of theory of change. Again, you can call out, but you've also got to call in, and you've got to be willing to work with those people when they're willing, when they want to work with you.
So let's turn to the media a bit. I'm going to start with Sarah's question, which is, do you think the 24-hour news cycle has any influence? Our current media model thrives on sensation and immediate reaction. Thoughtful contemplation and reasoned opinion are being lost.
This is such a good question, Paul, and I think it's one of the issues that's really bedeviling us as a community. So let's be honest, we don't just have a 24 news hour cycle, we have like a 24-second news cycle, right? Twitter reduced things to 180 characters or 240 characters now. I think TikTok has reduced things to like 15-second cycles, literally. And that the reductivism that comes from that, that compression is very unhealthy. Now, in many ways, this isn't new, right, Paul? There was that old adage in local news, if it bleeds, it leads. And you had tabloids, at the dawn of essentially the dawn of like the printing press, right? You can go back to the start of the 20th century and you had sensationalists, they called it the yellow press, right? That wrote crazy things that were libelous and terrible, but we had a set of laws that developed, like libel laws, if you will, that grew out of the experience of learning how to manage this kind of media monster. I think one of the challenges with today is you've seen long-standing regulations like the Fairness Doctrine peeled away, and you have exemptions in the laws like Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, or the Telecommunications Act, that allows for things like social media to be exempt from any liability. So there's some real need, not just for, I think, personal interventions, for us all to be a little bit, to dial down the drama, to be a little bit more responsible, to create space for nuance. There's also a need for policy interventions to create the conditions in which media will simply act more responsibly because they have to take responsibility for the things that they report.
Jonathan, sticking on the media for a moment, let's talk about social media, which is one of your favorite topics. Guessing you're not a fan of Elon Musk buying Twitter under the banner of unleashing more free speech. And you're quite critical in your book of the limited or even meek steps that companies have taken to address really the accessibility and viral spread of hate on their platforms. That I think one of the points you really raise is just how easy it is if somebody wants to get indoctrinated into hate. You can find it easier than you could when we were kids, and the ability to spread it is so much faster. And so, how do we address the toxicity of social media? Like, it feels like it just gets bigger and bigger. Even the fact that Twitter's worth 44 billion is mind-boggling. I don't know. I use it regularly. I don't think it's worth 44 billion when I use it, but I do use it. But interested in your thoughts about how do we address just and I just want to add to that. We also know that social media is a big part of more and more research is connecting it to the epidemic and childhood depression and anxiety as well. It just seems like it's having it. There's some good it produces, but a lot of negativity too. How do we address that?
There's so much to talk about here. So first of all, I think as a backdrop, it is highly problematic, Paul. Let's first of all step back. Let's acknowledge that what we once considered the public square has simply changed. And so, as society changes, society is dynamic. It's almost like a living organism of sorts. And so, sure enough, the public square has changed. And what was once, again, the prior person asked about the 24-hour news cycle. Maybe news cycles were more like, a week or 2 weeks when you had printed press and things had time to catch up with each other. Now in this crazy compressed time frame in a globalized environment, social media has emerged as a kind of public square. It is a little, now by the way, those media companies weren't owned by the people. They were owned by the Sulzbergers and the Chandlers and the Grahams. And, so the idea of a few people owning media is actually not a new phenomenon, right? And so one of the things that, you know, the FTC or the FCC did was mandate the way that media companies would be owned, because there was too much consolidation and concentration in the hands of a few people. I say this just as a backdrop because in many ways, media oligarchs is not a new thing, or information oligarchs is not a new phenomenon. Nonetheless, we've never had an environment quite so global and quite so connected as today. And it's troubling that the public square would be controlled by Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and, you know, Larry and Sergey or whatever, like that. Let's just acknowledge that that's troublesome. And the way that even the laws work. So as a public company, Mark Zuckerberg takes public money, but the Class A ownership of his, you know, the way his ownership structure steered at Facebook is not really accountable to a board of directors because he has all the voting stock. So, and, you know, Evan has the same deal at Snap. And so you have these companies who control so much of and Larry and Sergey have the same deal at Google. They're not even management anymore. So a handful of people have an inordinate amount of control over how we think about the debate. So I just want to acknowledge that I think that is problematic and merits a conversation. Now, that being said, pull back a little bit, Paul. I am a critic of social media because these companies, in large part because they're exempt from the kind of liability laws that govern the behavior of other publishers, behave in ways that are bananas. Like I was in the beverage business, as Sam acknowledged in her introductions. And after I sold, my business partner and I sold our company to Starbucks, you know, I worked there. And I had one conversation with Mark Zuckerberg where he said, Paul, and I think this is in the book, he said, you know, Jonathan, after a few years ago, users identified hate speech at Facebook. They flagged it. Today, our AI identifies 88% of the hate speech. So I think we're doing pretty good. And I was like, Mark, when I was an executive at Starbucks, I didn't get to say 88% of our beverages don't have poison in it. So I think we're doing pretty good. Right? Like my expectation is if 88% of the coffee beverages tasted bad or were poisoned, like the customers would sue us. We would be liable for that. But Facebook doesn't, as a social media company, because of this loophole in the law, it doesn't behave that way. So I think we definitely need a new policy environment just to make these companies play by the same rules. That's it. Just play by the same rules. That being said, I look at the Elon Musk situation, and heretofore, I'll tell you something, Paul, I'm a little bit, what's the word? Maybe it's counterintuitive. I have been cautiously optimistic about Elon Musk. Now, there are real issues with minorities on these platforms. You know, we look at Twitter, we monitor not just hate offline in the real world, but we monitor hate online at ADL. In our last survey, we do an annual online hate and harassment survey, Paul. We're about to reveal the 2022 numbers, but in 2021, we found that 41% of users of social media services report being bullied at one time or another over the past year, and 28% reported being the victims of serial harassment, systematic targeting. I mean, that's more than 1 in 4. And by the way, this predominantly happens, as reported to us, by users who identify as Muslim, African American, and AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders. So those numbers tell me, and we also know that Jews are also very often targeted, as are women, as other minorities. But I worry that if Elon Musk has this very libertarian attitude where anything goes, and Twitter is so important to the public conversation, without the right rules in place, Muslims and the minorities could find themselves targeted. Now, Elon Musk is not a guy who takes the easy path, right? This guy, after selling PayPal, which he helped to start, after he started a company called, I think it was called X, a payment platform that merged with PayPal, that he defined a whole new category with that company. Like he ran it. It was his business to find a brand new category of online payment systems and sold to eBay for billions. And then what did he do after that? He started SpaceX to kind of deal with this issue of planetary travel. He started Tesla to create a more sustainable automobile company. He started the Boring Company to reinvent mass transit in dense urban environments. I mean, this guy has taken on some of the hardest, most difficult, pressing problems So when he wants to take on free speech, I approach that proposition somewhat optimistically. And then when he says he wants to do things like open source the algorithm, if it defaults down the middle, Paul, and then users can decide whether they want a more conservative or more liberal feed, if you will, or maybe a feed that fits to their fancy, rather than an invisible algorithm that they can't control, that could be good if we can all turn the dials. If he really gets rid of the bots and forces people to self-identify and authenticate their identities rather than hiding behind pseudonyms, that could also be really good. So there are things he could do, Paul, that might actually clean up Twitter, because Twitter is a cesspool today. Unfortunately, we know that, as we talked about a minute ago, if it bleeds, it leads. So it's easier to build sensationalism than it is to build seriousness. I mean, look, like, you know, Entertainment Tonight has, I think, probably more viewers in aggregate than, you know, PBS NewsHour. However, I also believe, Paul, if his system becomes overrun with extremists, if it becomes, you know, saturated with white supremacists and other kind of people who, you know, share radical views, the brands will bolt. So the Fortune 500, the Fortune 1000s, and I've worked with all these companies, or many of them, they don't want their brands, you know, flighted against, you know, white supremacist content. They don't want their, you know, their images, their advertising slotted against nasty anti-Semitic poison. So I think, God willing, Elon Musk will take a more, I think, inspired view of this. God willing, the brand advertisers who are critical to the business model will keep him honest. Now, but you know what? He announced today he's going to put Trump back on the platform. Trump, who was a serial violator of Twitter's terms of service, who used it to incite violence against people. So the question will be whether or not Elon has any terms of service. But if he doesn't, you know, there's enough options out there that I think people will leave the platform if they find that it degrades them. So let's hope that happens.
Thanks, Jonathan. So one of the
Sorry
things,
for the long answer, Paul. I think I'm giving you these long answers, so
I'll
try to tighten it up.
You even write about your passion on this issue of social media in the book, and so I think a lot of us struggle with that. I appreciate your answer. One of the things I did struggle with in your book, and I've both read others' critiques that struggle with it and spoken to people who struggle with it, is the boundary between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. And, you know, from some of the examples you gave in the book, it's kind of still unclear to me where the line is between criticizing the policy of the Israeli government, of the Likud party, and anti-Semitism. And so what is appropriate criticism of Israel that doesn't cross that line?
I mean, if you want to look at a website where you can find criticism of Israel that doesn't cross the line, check out this website, Paul. Here's a good reference point. Write this down. adl.org. That's adl.org. Because we criticize Israel. We criticize policies of the Israeli government, and we don't do it in a way that's anti-Semitic. Look, every government on the planet, every government on earth can be criticized for its policies or its practices. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with criticizing policies of the state of Israel. Nothing wrong with that. Where it becomes problematic is when, number one, I would say when you don't just criticize policies of the government, but you demonize the Israeli people. I would say number two, it becomes problematic when you don't just, again, take issue with certain practices, but you delegitimize the state itself. And number three, when you hold Israel to double standards that are different than the way that we think about other countries. And so the reality is, I appreciate that there can be some complexity for people, but I think you can look at the ways that we criticize the American government and its policies, and there's plenty to criticize. It doesn't make you un-American, right? But America isn't, you know, at war with its neighbors. America hasn't been on the receiving end of acts of terror for every year of its existence. We have a situation as it relates to the state of Israel where, there are people who don't just question policies of the Likud party, which, by the way, is not in power in Israel. Right now, the coalition government in Israel, for those who don't know, is you have conservative and liberal Jewish parties, and you have an Arab Islamist party. A party that wants Sharia law is in the governing coalition of the state of Israel. Yesterday, on Monday morning, they swore in the first Muslim Supreme Court judge, Muslim judge on the Israeli Supreme Court. Last I checked, we don't have any Muslim judges on our Supreme Court in the United States. So the idea that Israel is monolithic, that it isn't a diverse, pluralistic democracy and society is just not true. But when you demonize a state and sort of say that Israel's government policies are apartheid or are like Nazi Germany, and you make the kind of comparisons that are clearly outlandish and designed to provoke, rather than to elucidate, let alone promote peace, that's where it becomes very problematic. And I'd like to give you an example. The ADL tracks anti-Semitic incidents in America. We do this. We've been doing this now for 43 years, since the 1970s. And last year, in 2021, we counted more anti-Semitic incidents than we have ever seen in any year of doing this work. Now, by the way, the numbers were going down until 2016. Paul, what happened in 2016? And then the numbers increased 34%, 57%. They went down 4% the year of Pittsburgh. They went up 12%, the highest year we ever saw in 2019. They dropped 5 points in 2020. It went back up 30 plus points in 2021. We have almost triple the number of incidences last year than we did in 2015. The numbers are astonishing. But unfortunately, Paul, like almost a year ago to the day when there was fighting in Gaza, when Hamas lobbed rockets at Israel and that conflict broke out, we saw Jewish people being beaten up across America. We had a wave of assaults. We recorded a 150% increase in anti-Jewish acts in the month of May 2021 versus the prior year. And the people attacking Jews in Times Square, Paul, on La Cienega Boulevard in Los Angeles, like on the Strip in Las Vegas, they weren't wearing MAGA hats. They weren't white supremacists. They were people coming from anti-Israel rallies. And 2 weeks ago, after there was another wave of terror attacks in Israel, about a dozen people were killed. Teachers, parents, toddlers, elderly people, Arab, Jewish, Muslim, Druze. What was the response of some of the anti-Israel organizations? They marched in Midtown Manhattan, Paul. It wasn't demonstrations, stop the violence. It wasn't demonstrations, give peace a chance. The call was to, quote, globalize the Intifada. The Intifada being the violent conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. So I believe in a two-state solution. I believe Palestinians need their own state to provide them with dignity and equality, just like Jewish Israelis deserve their own state that gives them safety and security. But I think you can be pro-Palestinian without being anti-Israel. I deeply believe that. I am convinced, and it's a conviction for me. And to be perfectly honest, those people who would denigrate Israelis or deny their humanity, I think that's another issue entirely. And the last thing I'll say, many of us, including myself and ADL, spoke out vociferously when President Trump and other fellow travelers were demonizing Latino people and immigrants relentlessly every single day. And then we saw, of course, what happened in El Paso. And many of us spoke out, like, I don't have any sympathy for the Communist Party in Beijing, the way they treat the Uyghur Muslims or ethnic Tibetans, the way that they deal with democracy protesters. I mean, the way that they have a surveillance state. But Paul, I don't think it's acceptable, just because I'm angry about those policies, to attack elderly Asian American people in America, or to deface Chinese restaurants, or to attack them online. So in the same way that I'm against anti-Latino xenophobia or against anti-Asian hate, So I think you can be upset about policies in the Middle East. That is not an excuse to attack Jewish Americans or to claim that, oh, every time I criticize Israel, you say I'm anti-Semitic. No, I'm sorry. There's a way to do it that's principled, that's responsible, and that doesn't contribute to hate. And that's all that we're talking about here.
Thanks, Jonathan. The beyond the interpersonal and grassroots work you recommend, you also in the book write about the Protect Plan for federal and state leaders and what governments can do to address hate in their society. What are some of the kind of highlights you would recommend? I mean, I realize it's a bunch of things, but I'm wondering what are some of the ones you think are most important?
So we developed the Protect Plan as a strategy to try to combat the threat of domestic violent extremism. I believe that white supremacy is a global terror threat. And I believe specifically the white nationalism in this country is the single most dire threat to the Union. We saw this from Charlottesville to Capitol Hill. There's kind of a straight line from those horrible incidents. And now the FBI recognizes it, and AG Garland and FBI Director Wray, President Biden have all spoken about the threat of domestic terrorism. So the Protect Plan is ADL's recommended policy approach. It's an acronym, stands for a few things. Number one, prioritize preventing and countering domestic terrorism. You got to prioritize it and call it out, which is fine, which didn't happen in the prior administration. It's finally happening now. Number two, resource according to the threat. We need to make sure that local law enforcement, the federal government, are applying budgetary resources so they have the tools they need to tackle this problem. That doesn't mean we need Patriot Act Part 2, but it means training and resources to investigate and counter this problem. Number three, no extremists in government service. Like, do I really have to say this? But we know that we have oath keepers, like in law enforcement agencies. We have Proud Boys in police departments. I mean, that is not a good idea. People with a penchant for violence shouldn't be handed the tools of the state. I'm sorry. And the military and law enforcement, Paul, used to have strict guidelines. If you had Nazi tattoos and things, you couldn't get a job. They've lowered their standards. They need to raise their standards again to keep our communities safe. How can communities of color expect to feel safe when there are white supremacists, in uniforms patrolling them? I mean, fourth, we need to take domestic terrorism prevention measures, implementing strategies to stop this from mutating. The E in Protect stands for ending the complicity of social media companies. We already talked about that. There's more they can do to deal with the threat on their platform. The C in Protect is to create a clearinghouse, a federal clearinghouse to share information about domestic extremism threats. Too often law enforcement agencies are silos and they don't share data. We've been collecting this data at ADL for decades and decades. We think there should be an independent clearinghouse, much like you have to deal with the issue of exploited children. So the memes and the icons and the language and the other kind of images can be shared effectively by the people who need to know. And then finally, the last T in Protect is target the foreign white supremacist terror groups. Again, white supremacy is a global terror threat. And these organizations that move between, we know there's a lot of cross-pollination, Paul, between Europe and North America, between these different organizations. We need to call that the foreign terror threat it is so that the State Department and other entities can take action.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to close with a question, which is giving you a chance to give us hope. These are dire times. They're stressful times. We consume this 24-hour media. We see social media. We see a lot that can really create anxiety. It's very anxious times we're in.
Yeah.
But there's also hope. And so I want to give you the chance to kind of turn on your hope meter and talk about, like, why should we be hopeful that things won't happen here?
Oh my God. There's so many reasons to be hopeful. Like, I'll be very honest, and this may sound Pollyannish, Paul, but I believe America is literally the most vibrant democracy in the history of humanity. For all of its issues, and there are plenty of issues. It's a country that was, there are plenty of flaws in the American example, from the enslavement of Africans to the genocide of indigenous people to the constant complexities we've had discriminating against various groups. And yet the founding fathers set this nation up to be a, quote, more perfect union, and recognized in our constitutional system to create the space to self-correct, right? And the amendments give us the opportunity to improve our system of self-governance. And the three branches create checks and balances that ostensibly work, let alone the relationship between the federal government and the states. So I say all this only to make the point that our democracy is resilient, and our institutions are strong, and our values are deep. I think America can basically achieve almost anything it sets out to accomplish. And I am hopeful because of the system that we have. I am hopeful because of all of the ingenuity with which it was designed. And by the way, Paul, I am so hopeful because of the next generation. They are more tolerant, they are more pluralistic, they are more respectful, they are more open-minded. It's extraordinary. And they, look at the innovations we've just talked about on this call tonight. From innovations the kind that Elon Musk has pioneered in different categories to kind of innovations that you've pioneered, the collective impact. You see innovation across the spectrum of the private sector and the public spaces and civil society. And that penchant for innovation and invention is so essential to the American, like to the DNA of our democracy. So I think our system itself and the people who animate it and energize it give me unbelievable hope every single day.
Thank you, Jonathan. And again, so great to see you. Michael says, Jonathan for president 2024.
Yeah. If he means president of my local PTA, perhaps.
And I'm going to turn it back to Chris from Boswell Books to close us out. Again, I hope you'll tell people where to find Jonathan's book because it's great and people should read it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you both so much for this conversation. Paul, Jonathan, what a wonderful evening it has been. If you look in the chat right now, I did just drop a link in to purchase a copy of It Could Happen Here. And I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Again, Paul, Jonathan, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who joined us. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Enjoy the beautiful weather in Milwaukee, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great to see you.
Paul, what a treat. Thanks so much for doing this with me. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. It was great.
Come visit in New York, Paul.
We'll be back.
Open invitation.